Kyrie eleison. Hello, and welcome back to the Catholic Workers Podcast, a space where we explore the intersection of Catholic social teaching, labor history, and the daily struggles of the working person. Today, we're taking on a giant, an idea that governs our lives, shapes our politics, and tells us how we're doing as a nation: gross domestic product, or GDP. We hear about it constantly on the news, in political debates, and in business reports. A rising GDP is hailed as a sign of success, while a falling GDP signals a crisis. But what is this number really? Where did it come from? And what does it truly measure? We'll be asking a crucial question: what does GDP miss? We'll explore its profound limitations, and then, drawing from the well of Catholic social teaching, we'll imagine a new kind of economy, one that measures what truly matters: human dignity, the health of our communities, and the common good. The idea of measuring the total output of a nation's economy is surprisingly recent. It's not something that's existed since time immemorial. For most of human history, economies were local and agrarian, and their success was measured by the abundance of the harvest, the size of a flock, or the prosperity of a single family or community. The very notion of a single number that could capture the economic life of an entire nation would have been alien to our ancestors. The first glimmers of modern national accounting appeared in the 17th century, in a time of political and economic flux. In England, figures like Sir William Petty and Charles Davenant began to make rudimentary calculations of national income. But their motivations were not to measure well being. Their work was driven by the desire to understand the nation's capacity for taxation and to gauge its power relative to other states. Petty, in his work Political Arithmetic, sought to calculate the wealth and strength of England, aiming to show that it was a formidable power despite its smaller size compared to France. These early attempts were more about national security and revenue than about people's quality of life. For over 200 years, these methods remained niche and unstandardized. It wasn't until the great economic crisis of the 20th century that the need for a comprehensive economic measure became urgent. The Great Depression exposed a gaping hole in our understanding of the economy. Policymakers had no idea how widespread the economic collapse was or how deep the crisis ran. They were essentially flying blind, trying to fix a broken engine without any gauges on the dashboard. This is where the American economist Simon Kuznets entered the picture. In 1934, at the request of the U.S. Congress, he developed a groundbreaking report titled National Income 1929 to 1932. This report was a revelation. It didn't just guess at the state of the economy. It provided a formal, systematic framework for national accounts. For the first time, policymakers had a clear, data-driven picture of the catastrophic decline in national income. Kuznets's work, which originally measured gross national product, or GNP, was a landmark in economic history. But it's important to note a crucial point about Kuznets himself. He was deeply skeptical of using this metric as a measure of a nation's welfare. In his report, he famously warned that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income. He pointed out that it didn't account for things like environmental degradation or the distribution of income. This is a point that's been largely forgotten as his creation has come to dominate global discourse. While Kuznets's initial work was a response to the Depression, the real catalyst for the widespread adoption of GDP was the ultimate economic mobilization: World War II. The war effort was a monumental logistical challenge. Governments needed to know exactly what their economies were capable of producing. How many planes could they build? How much steel could they forge? How many tanks could they roll out? GDP provided a critical tool for government to assess their productive capacity, allocate resources, and manage their economies with unprecedented efficiency. The U.S. Department of Commerce, under Milton Gilbert, institutionalized Kuznets's work, making it central to wartime planning and solidifying its ultimate role as the ultimate measure of a nation's strength. After the war, the global community faced the massive task of reconstruction. At the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, leaders from around the world gathered to create a new international economic order, giving birth to institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. In this new order, a standardized, internationally comparable metric was essential. GDP provided this tool. It became the main yardstick for measuring a country's economic performance, guiding reconstruction efforts, and promoting economic global stability. The shift from gross national product, which measures the output of a country's residents regardless of where they are, to GDP, which measures output within a country's borders, became the global standard. So with all that history in mind, let's break down what GDP actually is. At its core, gross domestic product is a monetary measure of the total market value of all the final goods and services produced within a specific country in a specific time period. It essentially provides a snapshot of the size and health of an economy by calculating the value of everything that is officially bought and sold. Economists use three primary approaches to calculate this number, all of which should, in theory, arrive at the same final figure. The first is the expenditure approach. This is the most common and intuitive method. It simply sums up all the spending on final goods and services in an economy. The formula looks like this: GDP equals consumption plus investments plus government spending plus net exports. Let's break this down with an example. Consumption is what a household spends. This is the purchase of a new TV, the cost of a haircut, or the price of groceries. It's the biggest component of GDP in most developed nations. Investment is business spending. This includes a company buying new machinery for a factory, building a new office, or a family purchasing a newly constructed home. It's spending meant to increase future productivity. Government spending is what the government spends on goods and services. This includes building a new highway, paying the salaries of public school teachers, or purchasing military equipment. And finally, net exports, which is exports minus imports, accounts for the country's trade balance. When a company sells its products abroad, which are called exports, it adds to the nation's production. When a country buys products from other nations, called imports, that spending leaves the economy. The second major approach is the income approach. This method looks at the economy from the opposite end of the transaction. It sums the total income earned from producing goods and services. Think about it this way: every dollar spent on a good or service becomes income for someone else. This approach includes wages and salaries for labor, profits for businesses, rent for the use of property, interest for lending money, and this method gives us a sense of how the economic pie is being distributed among the various factors of production. The third and final way is the production or value added approach. This method calculates the value added at each stage of production. This is a clever way to avoid double counting. Imagine you're making a loaf of bread. A farmer sells wheat to a miller for $1. The miller grinds the wheat into flour and sells it to a baker for $2. The baker bakes the bread and sells it to a consumer for $3. The GDP doesn't count the $1 of wheat, the $2 of flour, and the $3 of bread for a total of $6. Instead, it measures the value added at each step. The farmer produced $1 in value of wheat. The miller added $1 value, the $2 he sold it for minus the $1 he bought it for, and the baker added another $1 value, the $3 he sold the loaf of bread for minus the $2 of ground flour that he bought. The total value added is the final price of the loaf of bread, which is $3. This method ensures that we only measure the value of the final goods and services. Despite its widespread use, GDP is a deeply flawed measure of a nation's progress and the well-being of its people. By focusing exclusively on market transactions, it provides a very narrow and often misleading view of reality. It's like judging a person's health solely by how much they earn, ignoring whether they're happy, healthy, or have strong relationships. There are a few key ways in which GDP is an inadequate measure. The first is related to informal and unrecorded economic activity. GDP does not account for a vast amount of economic activity that happens outside of a formal, monetized market. This includes unpaid household labor, so think of the immense value created by parents raising children, a spouse cooking meals, or a family member caring for an elderly relative. This work is priceless, yet it's completely invisible in GDP calculations. A family that hires a nanny or a cleaning service sees their spending boost GDP, but a family that performs the exact same test for free is a zero in the equation. This is a profound omission, especially for women's labor, which has historically been concentrated in the home and therefore uncounted. A second big way is volunteer work. The millions of hours of labor contributed by volunteers in churches, charities, community centers, and schools create immense social value. This work builds social cohesion and supports vulnerable populations, but because no money changes hands, it's not reflected in GDP. Another way is the underground economy. Activities in the black market or informal economy, from a gardener who's paid in cash to the vast illicit drug trade, are not counted. This can significantly understate the true size of economies, especially in developing nations where a large portion of the population relies on the informal sector for survival. One of the second biggest inadequacies of GDP deals with environmental costs. Perhaps the most dangerous blind spot of GDP is its treatment of the environment. GDP treats environmental degradation as a positive or neutral externality. This leads to the absurd and paradoxical situation where environmental disasters can actually boost GDP. For example, a massive oil spill in a pristine waterway will be a disaster for the local ecosystem and the communities that rely on it. However, GDP will likely increase. Why? Because the money spent on the cleanup efforts, the wages of the cleanup crews, the cost of specialized equipment, the legal fees, all count as economic activity. The destruction of the environment is not a subtraction from GDP. The depletion of natural capital, the forests we cut down, the fish stocks we empty, the clean air we pollute, is not a liability on our national balance sheet. A country that pollutes its rivers to produce goods will see its GDP rise, but its true wealth and long term sustainability will be in decline. The third shortcoming of GDP is income inequality. A high GDP per capita can create the illusion of widespread prosperity when the reality is severe income inequality. Imagine a country with a high GDP but where 90% of the wealth is held by the top 1% of the population. The average income might look great, but it hides the fact that the vast majority of people are struggling. GDP is an average, and as we all know, averages can be incredibly misleading. They tell us nothing about the distribution of wealth or the lived experiences of the poorest members of society. The fourth way that GDP can be inadequate is talking about quality of life and well being. GDP measures material output, not human well being. It fails to account for things that make life worth living, such as leisure time. A society where everyone works 60 hours a week might have a higher GDP than a society where everyone works 40 hours a week, but is it truly better? GDP places no value on a family having more time together, on an individual having time for a hobby, or on the simple act of rest and contemplation. It treats leisure as an unproductive gap between work periods. A second big way is that it misses public health. A sick population might lead to a higher GDP because of increased spending on hospitals, doctors, and medications. A country with an epidemic of obesity and diabetes will see a boost in its healthcare sector, but no one would argue that it's a healthier or better society. The third is through measuring civic engagement and social cohesion. A society with strong community ties where neighbors help each other and people are engaged in civic life is a wealthy society in a way that GDP can't measure. GDP doesn't account for the value of a strong community, a feeling of security, or a vibrant democratic life. It's no wonder that in many countries with rising GDP, there is a concurrent rise in depression, anxiety, and a feeling of alienation. Prominent economists and public figures have been at the forefront of the beyond GDP movement, arguing that an over reliance on this single metric is misleading and even dangerous. Two Nobel laureates in particular have provided foundational critiques. Joseph Stiglitz has been a leading voice in this discussion, arguing that GDP can give a false sense of security. He points to the years leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, when GDP was rising, but it failed to signal the deep seated economic insecurity and rising inequality that were plaguing a majority of the population. Stiglitz co chaired the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, which produced a report arguing for a dashboard of indicators, a collection of metrics that would include measures of income distribution, health, and environmental sustainability, to complement GDP rather than a single number. Similarly, Amartya Sen has provided a powerful theoretical foundation for moving beyond GDP with his capability approach. Sen argues that the true goal of development is to expand people's freedoms and capabilities, that is, their ability to live the lives they have reason to value. In his view, GDP is only a means to an end, not an end in itself. He highlights that a country can have a high GDP but still have significant unfreedoms due to factors like poor public health, lack of political rights, or social deprivation. Sen helped develop the Human Development Index, or HDI, as a more holistic alternative to GDP that prioritizes human well being over raw economic output. In short, GDP is a powerful but narrow tool. It tells us how much stuff we're making and selling, but it tells us nothing about the quality of that life, the sustainability of our actions, or the fairness of our society. It's like a car's speedometer. It can tell us how fast we're going, but not whether we're driving in the right direction. This brings us to the heart of the matter. If GDP is an incomplete measure, what should an economy strive for? Catholic social teaching offers a powerful and comprehensive answer. It argues that the economy must not be judged by its output, but by its ability to serve human dignity and the common good. The bedrock of all Catholic social teaching is the dignity of the human person. Because every person is created in the image of God, they possess an inherent dignity that can never be lost. They're not merely cogs in an economic machine or instruments for production. Economic systems, therefore, must be designed to respect this dignity and ensure that people have access to the basic necessities of life and can participate fully in economic activity. A system that dehumanizes workers, exploits the poor, or treats people as a means to an end, from a Catholic perspective, is fundamentally immoral. This principle leads us directly to the concept of the common good. Economic decisions should not just benefit the individual or a small group, but should serve the well being of the entire community. This means creating a social and economic environment where all people, especially the poor and marginalized, can flourish. The common good is not just about the sum of individual goods. It's about the conditions that allow all members of society to reach their full potential. This includes a stable and just economic order, a clean environment, and a peaceful society. Finally, Catholic social teaching emphasizes solidarity. This is the idea that all people are part of one human family, regardless of their differences. It calls for a moral commitment to act for the good of all, especially the poor and those on the periphery. This is a fundamental challenge to individualistic or self centered economic models. Solidarity reminds us that our well being is linked to the well being of others, and that we have a responsibility to build a more just and equitable world. These principles have been consistently developed in a series of papal encyclicals over the past century and a half. The first and most famous is Rerum Novarum by Pope Leo XIII, and it's considered the foundational document of the modern Catholic social teaching. Written in response to the grim conditions of the Industrial Revolution, it condemned the exploitation of workers and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. It established that the state has a moral obligation to protect the rights of its citizens, especially the poor, and affirm the rights of workers to form unions and earn a just wage. Quadragesimo Anno, written in 1931 by Pope Pius XI, further developed these principles in the wake of the Great Depression. He introduced the principle of subsidiarity, which holds that decisions should be made at the lowest possible level of authority, empowering local communities and individuals. He called for a reconstruction of the social order to reflect these principles, criticizing how economic individualism and collectivism had led to social strife. Centesimus Annus in 1991 by Pope John Paul II was written on the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum and in the context of the fall of the Berlin Wall. He celebrated the triumph of human freedom, but also warned that the market should be subordinated to ethical norms in the pursuit of the common good. He argued for a society of work, enterprise, and participation where human capital, creativity, and knowledge are valued more than just raw production. Caritas in Veritate in 2009 by Pope Benedict XVI argued for integral human development, which encompasses the whole person in every dimension: economic, cultural, social, and spiritual. He emphasized the need for gratuitousness, giving without expecting return, and solidarity to be integrated into economic life, not just relegated to charity. He criticized a profit-only mentality that has led to a lack of social responsibility and environmental degradation, foreshadowing the themes that would be central to his successor. In Evangelii Gaudium in 2013, Pope Francis bluntly condemned what he called the economy of exclusion and the throwaway culture, where the powerful feed on the powerless and human beings are treated as disposable. He called for a new economic paradigm centered on social inclusion and the dignity of the human person. Given the profound limitations of GDP, a number of alternative measures have been developed to capture a more holistic view or well-being. These are not perfect, but they offer a different way of thinking about what it means to be a prosperous nation. One of the first is the Human Development Index, as mentioned before. Developed by the United Nations, the HDI is a composite index that measures a country's progress on three basic dimensions of human development: a long and healthy life, measured by life expectancy; access to knowledge, measured by education levels; and a decent standard of living, measured by GNI per capita. The HDI is a significant improvement over GDP because it offers a more holistic view of well-being by incorporating health and education, two foundational pillars of human flourishing. It provides a single clear number for comparison between countries and has been a powerful tool for policy advocacy. However, the HDI is an average and doesn't account for inequality within a country. It also omits other crucial factors for well-being such as political freedom, gender equality, environmental sustainability, and personal security. A country could have a high HDI but still have a massive gap between the rich and the poor. A second alternative measure is the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI. The GPI is a much more ambitious alternative to GDP. It attempts to measure economic welfare by including the social and environmental costs of economic activity. It starts with a measure of personal consumption and then adds or subtracts values for things that GDP ignores. The GPI includes positive contributions that are not monetized, such as volunteer work and household labor, but its real power comes from what it subtracts: negative factors like pollution, crime, and resource depletion. For example, if a country's GDP is rising due to increased factory production, but that production is causing widespread pollution that leads to health problems, the GPI would subtract the cost of those health problems and the environmental damage. This provides a better measure of sustainable economic growth. The biggest weakness of the GPI is the subjectivity involved in assigning monetary values to non-monetary things. How do you put a price tag on the cost of a ruined ecosystem or the value of leisure time? This can make it difficult to compare GPI data across regions or over time. A third alternative measure is the Better Life Index, or the BLI. This was created by the OECD, and the BLI is a departure from the single number approach. It's a more interactive tool that allows users to compare countries based on 11 different topics, including housing, income, jobs, health, education, and civic engagement. On their website, users can assign their own weights to each topic to reflect what they consider most important. The BLI's interactive nature empowers people to create a measure of well being that aligns with their own values. It provides a detailed, multifaceted look at well being that's far more comprehensive than a single number. It recognizes that progress is not a one size fits all concept. However, the very thing that is its strength, the lack of a single standardized score, makes it difficult to use for broad, formal comparisons between countries. It's more of a data visualization and educational tool than a definitive economic index. And the fourth alternative that we might look at is the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. While this is not an alternative to GDP to measuring GDP for measuring total output, the CPI is a crucial index that measures the average change over time in the prices paid by urban consumers for a basket of consumer goods and services. It's the most common measure of inflation. The CPI provides a crucial measure of inflation, which is essential for understanding the purchasing power of money and for guiding monetary policy. It helps determine real wages and economic growth. However, the basket of goods is a fixed list, so it can't quickly adapt to changes in consumer spending habits. It also may not accurately reflect the inflation experienced by specific groups like the elderly or low income households who spend disproportionately on certain goods and services. In the end, while GDP remains a powerful tool for understanding economic activity, it's a poor measure of human flourishing. Its rise to dominance has trained us to think about progress in terms of raw output, but this has come at a cost to our environment, to our communities, and to our very souls. It's led us to an economy of exclusion where the pursuit of profit is valued above all else. For Catholics and for all who seek a more humane economy, the focus must shift from pure production and profit maximization to a broader set of indicators that truly reflect the well being of the human person and the health of our communities. As Pope Benedict XVI said in Caritas in Veritate, integral human development must be the goal. This means prioritizing a diversity of indicators of development that go beyond a single number, literacy rates and access to quality education, physical and mental health measures, not just spending on a broken healthcare system, affordability indices for the poorest members of society, ensuring that basic necessities are within reach for everyone, civic engagement and democratic participation measures, and the health of our natural environment as a gift from God for all of humanity to enjoy and protect. Before we conclude, we would be grateful for your support in a few straightforward ways. If you enjoyed this episode of the Catholic Workers Podcast, please consider subscribing to our podcast on your preferred platform. This helps new listeners discover our content and ensures you don't miss future episodes. If you have a moment, kindly leave us a rating and a thoughtful review. Your feedback is invaluable as it not only helps us improve, but also assists in expanding our reach within the podcasting community. We're a listener supported podcast, and every contribution, no matter the size, helps us in continuing to produce these episodes. You can find us on Ko-fi by referring to the show notes for a direct link. Your generous support helps cover our production costs and sustain this podcast. Thank you immensely for listening. We invite you to join us next time as we continue to explore how our faith compels us to build a more just and equitable world, one conversation at a time. Until then, persist in the good fight.
Kyrie